I think one can boil the conflict down to two issues. They both relate to the issue of sovereignty, ultimately. The big picture point is this. Successive Russian leaderships since the breakup of the USSR have viewed Ukraine as being central to what they see as their country's sphere of influence. Successive Russian leaderships view Russia as a great power in the global system. And it's almost assumed within Russian policymaking circles that all great powers have a sphere of influence, whether or not they acknowledge that to be the case. So just as the United States is deemed to be the leading power with a sphere of influence in the West, and China has a sphere of influence in East Asia, so Russia is seen to be the dominant power in the former Soviet Union. And Ukraine is central to this. And really the current conflict between Russia and Ukraine is, I would argue, the latest attempt by Russia to reconcile Ukraine to a subordinate position in a Russia-led sphere of influence. So that's the big picture. Now, the immediate trigger for this conflict takes us back to the late 2000s when Ukraine began to negotiate an association agreement with the European Union. At the same time, Russia was building its own regional economic integration project, which was called the Eurasian Economic Union. The point being that for Russia, which was keen to rebuild its sphere of influence, including Ukraine, Ukrainian membership of the Eurasian Economic Union was seen as essential. The problem was, however, Ukraine could not be a member of the Eurasian Economic Union and have an association agreement with the European Union. Eventually, under great Russian pressure, the Ukrainian president at the time, Viktor Yanukovych, caved in and agreed not to sign the association agreement with the European Union in late 2013. That then triggered enormous protests in central Kiev, which went on for months and eventually led to a bloody crackdown by the authorities in Kiev, by the Yanukovych regime, which was then overthrown. As a result of the overthrow of Yanukovych, Russia then intervened first in Crimea and then in eastern Ukraine, which saw a very unpleasant, violent destabilization orchestrated by Russia. And this led to two ceasefire agreements. In September 2014, the so-called Minsk I agreement, and then the more important so-called Minsk II agreement in February 2015. And essentially both agreements, first of all, attempted to broker a ceasefire between the Russian-backed separatists and the Ukrainian army, and also lay the groundwork for a political settlement. So in a nutshell, that's the background to this very complicated conflict. The problem with the Minsk II agreement in particular, and it's important, I think, that we focus on Minsk II, because that is really the agreement that has been used or was being used for several years to try and bring an end to the war in East Ukraine. The problem with Minsk II, well, it was twofold. First of all, it sets out a very convoluted and unclear procedure and sequencing. And secondly, the political settlement, which it outlines, is also subject to competing interests, competing interpretations rather. So there are two parts. There's the part of the agreement that focuses on brokering a ceasefire and de-escalation of the conflict, and then there's the political settlement element. Now, neither side has ever really been, neither Russia nor Ukraine has ever been able to agree on the sequencing. So Ukraine demands, first of all, a lasting ceasefire, and only then talks about a political settlement, meaning elections in eastern Ukraine and some sort of devolution of political power to the regions of eastern Ukraine which are occupied. Now, Russia has always been demanding that the political settlement comes first, because Russia knows that if Russia withdraws its forces and the separatist forces from East Ukraine before a political settlement, it probably will not get the political settlement it wants. Now, the point about the political settlement is this. The key element there is the idea of special status. Russia demands that Ukraine give an extreme form of devolution to the occupied territories in East Ukraine, which would then be formally reincorporated into Ukraine, but would in fact enable Russia to control Ukraine from within. So this settlement would actually create a kind of Trojan horse, a constitutional Trojan horse at the heart of the Ukrainian political system. Now, that is completely unacceptable for Ukrainians. Large majorities of Ukrainians, according to opinion polls, are consistently opposed to this idea. No Ukrainian leader could seriously negotiate such an outcome without being driven from office, frankly. Any attempt to go down this path would almost certainly destabilize Ukraine politically. Nonetheless, that is the outcome that Russia has consistently been trying to force on Ukraine. Now, in terms of Western involvement in the negotiating process, the two countries that have been most closely engaged in the negotiations were France and Germany through a format called the Normandy format, which was created in 2014 and comprises Ukraine, Russia, France, and Germany. There have been attempts from time to time to try and find a middle way, a compromise between the Ukrainian position and the Russian position, particularly as regards the political settlement. The best known example of a compromise that was put forward was the so-called Steinmeier formula, which was named after the then German foreign minister in 2015. And essentially this proposed holding elections before a full Russian military withdrawal, and simultaneously Ukraine adopting a form of special status, which was essentially undefined. This got nowhere because, again, of deep political pressure, deep political opposition in Ukraine. And really since 2019, which was the last time that the Steinmeier formula was discussed by the Normandy format, there has been absolutely no movement in terms of the political settlement. So really the Minsk Conundrum, as I define it, again takes us back to this question of sovereignty. Is Ukraine sovereign, which is Ukraine's interpretation of the Minsk agreements, or should its sovereignty be limited, which is Russia's interpretation? And I think the experience of the Steinmeier formula shows that there is no middle way between those two irreconcilable positions. One of the key challenges, I think, facing any policymakers trying to resolve this conundrum until yesterday, when, of course, Russia formally recognized the so-called independence of these two political entities. One of the key problems increasingly was that both these entities were being steadily integrated into Russia's political, economic, and legal space. They were essentially becoming parts of the Russian Federation in factual terms. Of course, Russia, until yesterday, had not formally recognized their supposed independence, still less had annexed them. But the reality was on the ground that they were essentially extensions of the Russian space. So the economies were essentially run from Moscow. They were increasingly owned and controlled on the ground by Russian interests. The military and security establishments of both of these entities were essentially controlled by the Russian Ministry of Defense and the Russian Security Service. And I think most damagingly of all, Russia over time has been issuing thousands and thousands of passports to inhabitants in the region. I think the last estimate I saw was that something like 720,000 passports have been distributed to inhabitants of the Luhansk and the so-called Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics, such that they were actually able to vote in the recent Russian parliamentary elections even. So what all this means is that even before Russia recognized the so-called independence of these statelets, it was increasingly moot, increasingly unlikely that in the foreseeable future, these entities would ever be able to be reintegrated with Ukraine in any meaningful sense, because the political gap separating them from the rest of Ukraine was growing wider and wider. And as the conflict dragged on and on, of course, perceptions and emotions alienation on both sides of the line of contact were becoming increasingly bitter. And the populations on either side of the contact line were becoming more and more divided. So I think even before the events of yesterday, frankly, it was increasingly unlikely that in the foreseeable future, these entities would ever have been reintegrated into Ukraine, even if we'd had a Ukrainian leadership empowering Kiev, willing and able to negotiate such an outcome. And as I said earlier, that was simply never on the cards. So in effect, even before the events of yesterday, we were looking at an essentially open-ended, protracted conflict in eastern Ukraine, unfortunately. It's a very interesting question. Even if before the events of yesterday, even if we'd ever reached at such a political settlement, which to all intents and purposes, for practical purposes, I think was increasingly unlikely and virtually impossible to imagine. But even if we think, for argument's sake, that such an agreement had been reached, it would have taken many years, I think, to have reconciled people on both sides of the conflict to some sort of peaceful accommodation, because there would be quite apart from the question of the physical rehabilitation of the region, which has sustained terrible economic damage. So there'll be a huge price tag attached to that, and the question, of course, of who would pay for that. But there's the question also of things like amnesties for alleged war crimes that have taken place in the territory. There's the whole question of how you would actually go about organising local organs of government, courts, police forces, and then at the level of societies, actually being able to bring people together again and actually reconciling communities that have been often split down the middle by this terrible conflict. So you add all that up, and I think already it was becoming increasingly clear that there would be no serious reconciliation in the foreseeable future. Now, following the events of yesterday and Russia's recognition of these two political entities as supposedly independent states, the immediate question is, what does Russia do next? And the immediate concern, I think, is that there is a possibility now of significant renewed fighting. The reason I say that is that, as I mentioned earlier, Russia understood the Minsk II agreement as a means by which to reintegrate these two political entities into Ukraine, so that Russia would therefore be able to control Ukraine from within. Now, in effect, Russia has it's collapsed the Minsk agreement. And I think President Putin said today that Minsk is no more. So Russia actually has decided to relinquish leverage over Ukraine, and it doesn't have an obvious instrument with which to control or exert influence over Ukraine in the future. So there's a big question mark now about what Russia does in order to enable it to establish control over Ukraine. And I think one fear, we simply don't know what is going to happen, but one fear is that Russia may now intensify its use of military force in a much more significant and severe way, in order to force up some sort of political settlement on the Ukrainian authorities and thereby establish political control over Ukraine, which I would argue remains Russia's long-term goal here. So on the one hand, yesterday's decision on paper may seem to draw a line under the conflict. I very much fear it does quite the opposite. I think there's a real possibility now that this conflict may be moving into a new and even more dangerous phase. I think it is fairly clear already that there's been remarkable Western unity throughout this crisis. I think much more unity in terms of political solidarity with Ukraine, rejection of Russia's extreme demands, and also support for further economic sanctions. Much more so than many observers, I think, perhaps expected a few months ago. And I suspect much more unity than was expected in Moscow. Also, I think it's very important to emphasize the extent to which this crisis, I think, has re-galvanized determination within NATO not to get involved directly in any intensified fighting, heaven forbid, in Ukraine, but to reiterate the fundamental purpose of Ukraine, which is the collective defense of its existing members. So we've already seen reinforcements of NATO's strengthened military deployments in parts of Eastern Europe, notably the Baltic states and Poland. I personally would hope that this crisis has now served as a reminder, or possibly even a wake-up call in some areas, about the really important need for all NATO member states now to start boosting their defense spending in a really serious way to provide the long-term hard power capabilities that will be necessary to deter Russia. In terms of any further significant military escalation by Russia, and I hope and pray that that doesn't happen, but that clearly is a real danger at the moment. If that happens, then there will be further severe sanctions that will be imposed on Russia as day follows night. And that will, I think, impose a severe cost, not just on Russia's medium to long-term growth prospects, and that in turn raises all sorts of difficult questions and challenges for the current Russian leadership, but that will make life very, very difficult indeed for key members of the Russian elite who own assets, who have major economic interests that will be affected by these sanctions. And again, I think the kind of sanctions that are now being seriously contemplated, particularly in Washington, but also in London and Brussels, go way beyond anything that we've seen so far, and would, as I say, impose a very severe cost on Russia. In addition, I think it's also worth bearing in mind here that when one looks at where Russia is now in respect of its relations with the West, even if, as I dearly hope, Russia doesn't choose to escalate its use of military force and more economic sanctions are not put in place, Russia's political relations with the West are in the direst condition that they've been for decades now. I do not believe, as somebody, as an analyst who spent many years living and working in Russia, I do not believe that this can seriously be considered to be in Russia's own national, long-term national interest in terms of Russia's security. If Russia was looking to try and reduce NATO's commitment to defend its member states in Eastern Europe, it's had precisely the opposite effect. If Russia was looking to intimidate NATO member states into backing down from confrontation, it seems to have had precisely the opposite effect. I don't see how this can benefit Russia in the long term. And then, as I say, if we get into the realm of very severe economic sanctions, we have to be clear that some of these measures will be in place for years, if not decades. And again, the long-term effect on Russia's economy, prospects for growth, modernization, it seems to me are very, very negative indeed. So already it seems to me that the Russian leadership have seriously miscalculated. The fact that the Russia-China relationship has improved out of all recognition over the last 2 to 3 decades is a really important strategic factor in Russian thinking. There's a very interesting parallel actually with the current crisis, and that is the crisis around Poland in 1980, 1981. I remember at the time when I was at university, the serious concern that there was in the West about the real danger of a Warsaw Pact intervention in Poland in the winter of 1980-81 to crush the Solidarity trade union political movement. And again, thankfully, that didn't happen. At the time, one really important factor that did restrain the Soviet leadership was the fear that an invasion of Poland would further exacerbate relations not just with the West and NATO, but also with China, which at the time was in a deeply antagonistic relationship with the USSR. Now, clearly that the Russia-China relationship has improved out of all recognition compared with those days. And that has meant, for example, that in recent weeks, as Russia has strengthened its military buildup around Ukraine's border, one aspect of that has been that Russia has actually transferred much of its military capability from the Russian Far East and Eastern Siberia to Belarus and the areas of Russia bordering Ukraine, in the knowledge that its eastern flank is now much more secure. Also, I think another consideration here is that, particularly since 2014, when the West imposed pretty severe sanctions on Russia, to some extent, one impact of that has been to further reorient Russia's economy towards China and Asia. That was a process that predated 2014, but there's no doubt that the breakdown of relations with the West since 2014 has further accentuated that. And it may well be that policymakers in Moscow assume that to some extent they have further scope to build up economic relations with China in the event of further Western economic sanctions. Having said all that, there are many analysts, including Russian analysts, who will say that even if that is the case, Russia simply cannot find the capital and the kind of high-tech, the technology transfer from China that in the past it has relied on from the West. So even if there is a further deepening of economic relations with China, as I fully expect, in the event of the West imposing further economic sanctions on Russia, it's not going to be able to compensate Russia. And it seems to me that Russia really is looking at a further deterioration of its GDP growth prospects, if, as I fervently hope, if Russia does significantly escalate its use of military force and the West does impose further sanctions on it. There's no doubt that the humanitarian dimension of this war has been absolutely terrible. Over 14,000 people killed, many thousands more injured and wounded, huge numbers of internally displaced people, in addition to refugees, many of whom have actually moved to Russia, one of the largest numbers of internally displaced people in the world. Physical infrastructure damaged, huge dislocation to economic links between the regions either side of the contact line. So the human cost of all this has been absolutely appalling so far, and it continues to be a conflict that generates suffering on a huge scale every day of the week, just in terms of being able to provide basic services, ensure that people are receiving welfare and pension payments in these two occupied regions. It's been a catastrophe, and I fear that the longer that the armed conflict continues, and may even worsen, it may even worsen if, as some people are already suggesting today, Russia decides to reinforce its military deployments in these two entities. The fighting may get worse, in which case the humanitarian dimension will get worse as well. It really has been a catastrophe from that point of view. And let me just say one thing, in terms of outsiders' understanding of this conflict. I think there's sometimes a widespread misunderstanding about this question of ethnicity in Ukraine. Yes, there are large numbers of people who identify themselves as ethnic Russians, and even larger numbers of people who define themselves first and foremost as Russian speakers, in the sense that Russian is that they regard as their first language. But there is no real ethnic dimension to this conflict. So it's very, very different from conflicts elsewhere in the world. And what is, I think, particularly so tragic about this is that we're talking here about conflict having calamitous effects on communities of people who are ethnic Russians, ethnic communities, Russian speakers, Ukrainian speakers, who had lived together harmoniously for years, if not decades. This is an entirely artificially manufactured conflict. It does not have an obvious ethnic dimension to it. I think in analytical terms, it's highly misleading to portray it in that way. First of all, it's extremely difficult to make firm predictions. And I would be very suspicious of anybody who does. But to my mind, the underlying driver of this conflict remains as unresolved as ever. And that is, I go back to this question of sovereignty. Until such time as the political leadership of Russia acknowledges and accepts Ukraine to be a fully sovereign country, there is going to be conflict. There are going to be problems. This is going to be a troubled relationship. My fear is that under the current leadership in Moscow, it is highly unlikely, if not almost inconceivable, that there will ever be such an acknowledgement and acceptance of Ukraine as a sovereign country, certainly judging by the extreme language that President Putin was using in his nationwide address yesterday. So until that point, so essentially until there is some degree of political change in Russia, I fear that the underlying driver of this conflict is going to be there. And accordingly, we have to be on our guard, and we have to be prepared for continuing danger and continuing serious problems, including the risk of a further escalation of use of military force by Russia. I hope that that's not going to be the case, but I fear that that is a very real possibility at the moment.